saying, what must I do to be saved?
Testing. You're sure it's not on?
No, I'm flipping it both ways. Let me see if there's any extras up here.
Testing. Testing.
You have some? Oh, I didn't know that. I thought that one took a 9-volt.
No, that's the old one. We've upgraded.
Thank you, sorry about that. Thank you, Brent. Brent always comes to the rescue and takes care of stuff.
Welcome. We're glad to have you tonight and to be able to come out as we continue on. I have to tell you, it is so much fun. Been studying this. Wendy and I have been looking through it, and it brings back such good memories as I look at and think back to some of us who made that trip to the Holy Land. How many years ago was it, Tom?
No, it has. I've been here almost 10.
I bet it's been
so
15 or.
Yeah.
Oh my. You know, I remember back when I was in my early 20s, I guess really about 19, 20 years old, when I went out and served my first little country church. And everybody at the church where I went was 65 and older. It was a little country town. And so being 20, 21 years old, I thought, man, you know, I would be standing around visiting, and they'd be going, now, when did we do this back over at the parsonage, you know? And, well, let me see, that was back when, well, 5 years ago, 40 years ago when we did that now, you know? And Marcia and I'd walk off and go, oh, good Lord, you know? And now, when did we do that time? How many years ago was that? Yeah, now, when you have more experience and life has gone on, there's just more to dredge up, more to be able to remember. And you don't appreciate that when you're young. You haven't had enough experiences. Now that
I'll look forward to it one day, though.
Woo, okay. And so we're gonna turn off the live streaming while we have a public flogging. So
I'm always one call away from a new opportunity.
it is good to have you tonight, and it is fun, as I say, when I'm enjoying remembering back our trip to the Holy Land and seeing these wonderful sights. And we got some great stories for you tonight and some wonderful pictures. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Oh God, we thank you for tonight. A night when we pause in the midst of our week to stop, to study your word, to see how you have moved in history, to be reminded of how you still move in our history today. And we pray that as we go back and look through these stories tonight, that you would speak to our hearts, that you would open our minds, and that you might help us to think about how we do still see you moving in the world today. How do we learn from the past so that we can dream a new dream for the future? It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Tonight we are going to be looking at, I like the title of Fight, Flight, and Finding Dignity.
Identity.
Identity.
And dignity. I mean, all of that.
Our Jewish people, so many struggles and so many difficulties. And we've We've talked about that a little bit today as we were visiting, and may visit a little bit about it at the end if we have time. Just about how you look at the Jewish people and you think, what have they had to endure? And had to endure because they were Jewish. They're not any different. They believe in Yahweh. We also believe in the one true God. I always like to say, Jesus was a good Jew. So we look at what happens to them, the struggles that they have down through the centuries. And it's really an incredible thing. And when you see anti-Semitism today, you have to just shake your head and say, what in the world? And I think of all that they've had to go through, and sometimes they bring it on themselves, as we're going to see, and other times they don't. It's been quite a challenging world. Tonight we're going to wind up looking at the people of Israel, and we're going to be looking a little bit at what happens at Qumran. Qumran is located down near the Dead Sea. It's east of Jerusalem, almost staying just parallel to a Qumran community over on the Dead Sea. And we're going to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to look at what was happening at this time in history and something about what you're going to be seeing, or those who are going to the Holy Land and those of us who've been what we walked. You had three groups of people in Israel about this time, and it was kind of interesting. When you start thinking about society, and you look at our society even today, you had the priest, which were the Sadducees, and then you had the Pharisees. You call them the common people. I always like to think of the Pharisees kind of as they were the lawyers of that day. They focused on the law, and they knew it very, very well. And then you had the Essenes, and we're going to kind of look at the Essenes and who they were as a people. Fascinating thing is when you think about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and whenever you're reading in the New Testament, you'll be reading where it says, and the Sadducees did this, but mainly it's the Pharisees you read about. And you'll also read a whole lot about how, remember the people who are who write the New Testament, starting somewhere the earliest, with Paul, maybe the 50s and 60s, and then Mark, all the way up to about 100. And so they're writing now, as we're going to see, after the Great Revolt, which is the fall of Jerusalem. So they're going to be writing after this. And the group that disappears is going to be the Sadducees and the Essenes. So the only group you're really going to have left is going to be the Pharisees. And so if you got to call out a bad guy, you call out the one you're still fighting against. And so that's why when you read through the New Testament, be sensitive of when do they talk about the Sadducees or the Pharisees. And it's mainly going to be the Pharisees who take it on the chin. The Sadducees, they were going to be the priest, and Hellenism, that's an important one. For Hellenism, as you know, you have this Greco-Roman ethos, and it is based on the Greek thought taken over by the Romans, and this certain lifestyle and belief, and you then are going to have all the people who are against any kind of assimilating of culture into their lives, the Jews. They don't want to embrace Hellenism. The Pharisees, they're kind of, sometimes a little bit, maybe if it's good for them. The Essenes, absolutely not. The Sadducees, they were very practical people. They were wealthy, they were in charge, they were the priest, they made peace with Rome, and so they would kind of accept the Hellenistic way of life because that made their life very good. The Essenes are going to be the other extreme, going, you're selling out, you're not being true to who we're supposed to be, and so we're going to withdraw from you. And it's also kind of fascinating when you think about Judaism today, you kind of see a nice part of it going on in Judaism today. We have the Reformed movement who will be able to accept society. You're going to have the Pharisees, which are going to be the conservative movement, and they'll take some, but they don't follow all the laws. And then you have the Essenes, which would be more the Orthodox, who are going to maintain all of the law very carefully. And then you have the ultra-Orthodox who really go over the top. But so within Judaism today, you have three different branches mainly, and that is going to wind up being your Reformed, the most liberal, embracing culture, not necessarily following the laws. In fact, which was the one you were telling us about the gathering where you...
I went to a gathering when Bob and I both graduated from Perkins School of Theology at SMU. And when I was there, I had an opportunity to take a weekend retreat. It was a mini class, and it was a gathering of Christians, Muslims, and Jews in dialogue over different scripture passages for the weekend. And one of the interesting things is that the Jewish students that they brought in were from an Orthodox seminary, but the Jewish leaders that they brought in were Reform. And so when we gathered for mealtime, the Reformed Jewish leaders had no problems and kind of made a show out of eating pork. And in front of all the seminary Hebrew students who would not have done that, they kept kosher. And so it wasn't just that Christians, Jews, and Muslims were in dialogue or had differences. Here were these differing groups in Judaism that had far different beliefs.
And that's what we see back during Jesus' day, that you're going to have the Sadducees. And I love it. If you look down the list here, they're going to be literalists when they're looking more at the Bible. They believe in free will. You choose. It's not all predestined. And the afterlife, they didn't believe in the afterlife. But you look at the Pharisees, and this is one of those kind of things people don't understand, is that the Pharisees did believe in afterlife. And we always act like we think, well, all the Jews didn't believe in a heaven or an afterlife. And that's not true. The Sadducees did not, and you'll read that again in the New Testament. The Pharisees did. They were free will mostly, scholarly interpretations. But then you look at the Essenes, and no, it was not free will. God did control all things. They received inspired messages from God to know the truth, and they also believed in a spiritual survivor if you were living and doing the right things. So the idea that you're not being good enough and we have to withdraw from society, there were other people who acted like that, who would believe that down through the centuries, not Jewish, but we find so many different examples of that down through history. Can anybody think of one that was significant to the United States? In England, you had the Catholic Church, then you had the revolt. For those who've followed us through that stories, we went into the Anglican Church, and then you had those who said the Anglican Church was not pure enough, and so we developed the Congregational Church, and those who said the Congregational Church is not pure enough, and so they became the Puritans. And it's because they wanted to make sure that they could live pure and not be corrupted by society. They even got on a boat and left England to go all the way across the world to the United States, where they could set up their own colonies, and now we could be pure and withdrawn from all these other corrupt forces.
Think what happens when you have that kind of tendency that you are able to interpret the world and see that it is harmful to your spiritual life, and so you understand that God is telling you to withdraw. Well, right in that moment, you are claiming a special knowledge from God. How do you grow in that special knowledge? Well, you have to keep getting purer and more holy than others. And so it's kind of, you're trying to beat others to have more and more inspired secret knowledge. And you can see how that it never ends. You're never good enough. You're never pure enough. It just kind of snowballs.
When you look at the Jewish people, again, what we're trying to help you see is to say someone is a Jew, well, there was a lot of different feelings about that. You got those who are going to become the Sadducees, you got the Pharisees, now we're going to have the Essenes, and of course, amidst all that, you're still going to have people who are zealots, who really want to free Israel and not make peace with the Romans, those who are living well, those who have good jobs, those who are making money. they tend to be more willing to compromise with the Romans and the Hellenistic lifestyle. The poor and the working class who are being oppressed, they're getting kind of tired of it. And it's going to lead to a great revolt. They're getting tired of it, and so you have some in the Pharisees that tend to be more of the working class and the lawyers, and the Essenes just withdraw. Now, the fascinating thing, our picture of, we have their community. This is basically, we found the Qumran, and if you're getting ready to go on this Holy Land trip, you were going to go to Qumran, and in the end, they wound up excavating the area. And you will see these ruins where these people withdrew from society and came and lived. Now, one of the real downfalls for them was they also believed in celibacy. So whenever you move on, it's kind of hard to keep your community going.
You've got about one generation, you know. That's
In order to be pure, and they had received special revelation from God, they had gotten it, and God had told them to be celibate. So they weren't going to be passing on that special message to anybody else. They went and lived in their community away from the world, and we weren't going to have any more children. So this community was kind of doomed from the beginning to be able to continue on. What we're going to look at tonight that's really interesting is, because they were so serious about their faith, and they were, there would be the copying and the making of scrolls. And some of the scrolls we know today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are basically 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're going to see how they were found and things, but this is one of them, and you're going to start on the right, move to the left, and this meticulous copying. Well, what they're going to find is these were books from the Old Testament, and here, this is going to be found in 1947, but we're going to be able to look at the Bible that we have today, and they're going to go, they find these scrolls from the time of the Essenes, because it's at Qumran, and this is the time of Jesus, and they're the same. I mean, everybody's going, what things are we going to find? How has it changed? How has it been different? There might have been a word or something here. It's the same. 2,000 years later, we're able to look at what we have today, and it can be back to that, which we know also goes back another 1,000 years to the time that they'd have been first being written. So it really was an incredible, incredible find of staggering value. If you look at the picture we have of where this is back in Qumran, where you would have been laying out the scrolls. It's the scriptorium. And you can see how long that was, how long you would roll these scrolls out.
So you need that long.
Yeah, look at how long that is. Go ahead and flip for that. You have these long scrolls, that's how they would do it. And so when you have Qumran, then you would have the scriptorium. That's going to be the room where you'd lay out the scrolls and you'd be working on them and copying or reading them. I mean, really a cool thing to be able to think about. That's where 2,000 years ago, people would have been writing the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Imagine just this kind of work to copy and be that meticulous, be that precise, over and over. That's your passion, and they did it extremely well to be that accurate.
So they'd get these and they'd roll them up. As we know, you put them to make them into a scroll. You roll them up and you put them into these clay jars, these pots. You would put these tops on them, and of course then they were incredibly valuable. They wanted to protect them. And as time went on, and they also realized what was going on in the world, and they feared people, that's not a great fortress, could easily get overrun. So they took these clay pots and these scrolls, and they went and they hid them in caves. This is a copy of one of what the cave would actually be like, where the scrolls were going to be held. But there are actual caves, just like this around Qumran, where you would go and they went and hid these jars in this. And to think that now the climate, as you're going to see if you go over, it's a little dry. A little dry, very rocky. It's not like living by the Gulf of Mexico down in Houston where the humidity is at 106%. These things sat in clay pots for 2,000 years and survived. I mean, did not just weather and go away. I mean, it truly is
It's amazing.
Amazing. I mean, you think about the finds you would have. So now that we discovered, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but we discovered these Dead Sea Scrolls, this incredible find, oldest our part. They went and built a beautiful place to put them. It's called the Shrine of the Book, and this is what it looks like. What does that remind you of? Yeah, the answer's been a Hershey kiss. That's true. It's not the symbolism they were looking for. It's the top of one of the clay pots we were just seeing.
Or a Hershey kiss.
Or a Hershey kiss. One of the two. Now, both are very sweet. So you have, that's the top of a clay pot, and then I'll show them the inside of how it actually looks. What they did, because these things are they're long, they created this nice round display so you could take the scroll and have it all the way around on the display, and then of course it's protected and people could come around. And again, scrolls, we know they're all rolled up. That's what we were just doing, rolling them up, putting them in clay pots. And so they made this in the round so that just like it's reading the scroll, and it could be displayed and people could come down inside this jar and be able to go around and read the scroll. I mean, what a cool deal. But it's more than a cool deal.
One of the amazing things about the scrolls is the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language was never a dead language. It was when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD, the language was almost put up on a shelf as a spoken language. They would use it in religious ceremonies, but it was almost that the pain was so great at losing the temple that they didn't speak it conversationally. But it was always part of their religious ceremonies. They would know how to read it and speak it, but they didn't do it in a conversational manner. So at the late 1800s, Eleazar ben Yehuda really felt that the Hebrew language needed to be reclaimed. And so many things are happening at this time of the building of a state of Israel, but he wanted the people of Jewish descent, of Jewish beliefs, to claim that as part of their identity, the Hebrew language. And so he started building kindergartens and having all these children grow up learning to speak Hebrew. What's fascinating about the Hebrew language is that, again, it was never dead. The Hebrew language that is spoken now is what was basically spoken then. I mean, back then they didn't have words for electricity and the internet and stuff like that, but you can learn Hebrew now and you can read these scrolls. And it's the same Hebrew lettering that are on the signposts, in letters, and everything now. So this is one of the oldest living languages on earth. One of the cool quotes that we came across about Ben Yehuda is that it said that in a book called Was the Hebrew Language Ever a Dead Language? And the answer is no. It said that people always could speak Hebrew before Ben Yehuda, and afterwards they did. He made sure in a relatively short period of time that this became the national language and people would be able to speak conversationally in Hebrew. And so it's an incredible thing to have this. In ancient Greek, if you learn Greek now, it's not the ancient Greek of the past. That is a dead language. And so it's something really amazing that happened not only with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but with the language, the land, the identity of the people.
So this is the inside of that display we just saw. From a more standing back position. You can see the top, the white, of course, is the scroll, and above it is, just like you'd see a scroll, the handle you would actually have of it. But if you notice how it looks like it's kind of on a, this is built to withstand a nuclear blast. That it would begin to, it goes down into that area, and the top there then is for it to come in. It is to seal this thing up to survive a nuclear blast. That's how important they believe these scrolls are. Go down. Not solid, the walls aren't the 90-degree angles. It is an amazing construction because they believe that's how important the scrolls are.
It was back in 1947. I want to show you this one picture one more time because one of the things that's amazing to me is the look of these caves. Now, if you're a shepherd in throughout the centuries, there's not a lot to do, okay? If you've been to Israel, you know what I'm talking about. There's nothing out there. There are no trees to climb. You're not playing in the creeks. It's rock and more rock. And so after the sheep have eaten and had something to drink, what are you going to do? You can tell by this light limestone, these caves stand out. You can see them for a mile or so away. So for thousands of years, teenagers, young children, these shepherds have grown up in this area and been able to see these caves. And for me, I grew up such a tomboy. I climbed trees out, we had this creek out in front of our house. And I can't imagine those caves being unexplored for that long. They're not hidden. They stand out. And so we talked about what a grace moment it was. In 1947, there were shepherds that one of their sheep ran off, and a teenage boy ran after it, and there was this dark cave, so he threw a stone in, thinking it would, scare the sheep to come out, and it hit something that obviously wasn't rock. It hit a jar, a clay jar, and so he came back the next day with friends, and then these Bedouin shepherds took control over a scroll that they found in one of the jars. They went to Bethlehem to an antiquities dealer. Now, this whole story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is really just like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones. It is crazy how all this happened. They take it to this guy, and he is a Palestinian Christian in Bethlehem. And he recognizes that they have something of extreme value. And so he encourages them to go back and explore the caves. And in total, they find 7 scrolls. And so they come back, they sell 4 to him, and then 3 to another antique dealer. When they sell 4 to him, he in turn finds another buyer, the Syrian Archbishop, Mar Samuel, and he buys 4 of the scrolls for $100.
That was a good investment.
That's a good investment. So 4 of the scrolls are now with the Syrian Archbishop, and 3 they sell to another antique dealer. Well, at the same time, there is a professor at the Hebrew University by the name of Eliezer Lipa Sukenik. He was the first professor of archaeology at Hebrew University. And so he starts hearing rumors, whispers of some ancient Hebrew text being found. And so he goes to check it out. Well, this is 1947. What is getting ready to happen? Israel's about to become a state. So it is a very tense time in the area. There's a lot of security. There's a lot of tension. And so he goes through all these checkpoints, and he tries to avoid all these guards. He has some narrow misses, but he finally is able to come face to face with these texts, and he recognizes that they're of immense value. This is, it's like Indiana Jones. This is what he writes. My hands shook as I started to unwrap one of them. I read a few sentences. It was written in beautiful biblical Hebrew. The language was like that of the Psalms, but the text was unknown to me. I looked, and I suddenly had the feeling that I was privileged by destiny to gaze upon a Hebrew scroll which had not been read for more than 2,000 years. So, the Hebrew professor, Professor Sukenik, hears about these scrolls and he risks his life to come and find them. He is able to buy 3 of the scrolls that went to the other antique dealer, okay? He buys them on November 29th, 1947, the day that the United Nations revealed their partition plan for 2 states in Palestine, one for Arabs and one for Jews. On the very day that this is the declaration, he has purchased 3 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's a very meaningful, deeply spiritual time for him. But now he knows that there are 4 other scrolls out there, and it becomes his life's mission to bring those other 4 and have one collection. But as you can imagine, this is an incredibly dangerous time, very scary. And so the Syrian archbishop decides it's too dangerous. He decides to go to the United States and start churches here, but he smuggles the 4 scrolls with him. So he takes the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, brings them to the United States, and Professor Sukenik works the rest of his life to try to get those scrolls back. For years, till 1953, he tried in vain to get the scrolls, and in 1953, he passes away. In 1954, Archbishop Samuel, he wasn't idle all this time. He had been going around all these years to different universities in the United States, including Yale University, to try to sell the Dead Sea Scrolls. And no one will buy them. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around this. It really does seem...
Of course, at this point, they had not been declared the Dead Sea Scrolls, and look how amazing. I mean, they had been found, how they would look, but the true value was not understood or appreciated at this point. Someone had some antiquities, and they could look at it and go, is it real? Is it false?
It's not too long after World War II, and so this hadn't been the priority.
Yeah.
But nobody will buy them, and so in 1954, the year after Professor Sukenik passes away, he doesn't have any other way to get rid of the scrolls, and so what do you do when you want to sell something? You have a classified ad in the newspaper. Seriously. He runs a classified ad in the Wall Street Journal, the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. This would be an ideal gift for an educational or religious institution. So always be sure to read the classified ads. You'll never know what you'll find. This came out in the classified ads section, and it just happened to be read by the Israeli consul general who was in the United States at the time. And he contacts his friend, Yigal Yadin, who is doing lectures across the United States at that very moment. And he contacts Yigal Yadin, who, by the way, just happens to be the son of Professor Sukenik. And so they understand, you can hear it, gives me goosebumps. So they understand that if the state of Israel makes a move to purchase these scrolls, that won't go over very well. There's too much tension. And so they go through a third party, and he ends up buying the Dead Sea Scrolls. He pays $250,000 for them. So if you buy something for $100 and you sell them for $250,000, except that he wrote up, the Archbishop wrote up the bill of sale wrong, and he paid almost the entire amount back to the IRS on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which very sad because that would have been a huge profit. But Yigal-Yadin was able to purchase the 4 remaining scrolls and bring them back and fulfill the dream of his father and his own life passion to restore the scrolls back to the nation of Israel. Just an incredible thing. In the midst of all this, you understand, Israel was declared a state. This is the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and this is the airport that we fly into in Tel Aviv is named after him. And this is him reading the Declaration of Israel becoming a state in 1948. All of this is happening. So the scrolls, those caves were never explored in 2,000 years until the year before all this starts to roll out. And so this is what Yigal-Yadin said. I cannot avoid the feeling that there is something symbolic in the discovery of the scrolls and their acquisition at the moment of the creation of the state of Israel. It's as if these manuscripts have been waiting in caves for 2,000 years, ever since the destruction of Israel's independence, until the people of Israel had returned to their home and regained their freedom. This symbolism is heightened by the fact that the first 3 scrolls were bought by my father for Israel on November 29th, 1947, the very day on which the United Nations voted for the recreation of the Jewish state after 2,000 years. So all of this is transpiring, and so today we have this incredible archaeological find made available to the public because of all these intricate maneuvers that seem like grace moments to us in our discussion.
So why were they hidden in the first place? Because at this time, with the Essenes community, things were in great unrest going on there in the land of Israel. One of those who had been born was a man named Josephus in 37. So in 37, he was born. That's Jesus, we think, was crucified somewhere around 33. Josephus is born and is going to grow up. He is born to his father was a priest, so we're talking Sadducees. His mother claimed to be a part of royal line. There's no doubt that their family was wealthy. He grew up being educated, so he had the opportunity for finer things in life. And he becomes someone very strong and committed in his faith. His father had been a priest. Well, what we know begins to happen is that the Roman people, and unfortunately those of the Sadducees, really just kind of did not look after for the middle class and the lower class of the Jews. And times got tougher and tougher. And what happens when you don't take care of everybody, if everybody isn't getting a piece of the pie? There's rebellion. And so rebellion takes place there in Israel. And they begin to revolt. It starts at Caesarea, and the Great Revolt is on. It's going to go from 66 to, I guess, 73, kind of the last little bit there at Masada. But you're going to have the Great Revolt get started. And now Caesarea's up north. You're going to be up towards Galilee. And this young man becomes a real military leader, Josephus. He would ultimately go to Rome and negotiate freedom of some prisoners, get them back. When he came back, everybody's going, you did it? You actually negotiated the release of these prisoners? Boom, they make him a general, and he is now leading armies up there in the Galilee area, the northern part of Israel, to be fighting against the Romans. And in the early days, they win. I mean, the Romans were not prepared for this. You have this uprising. They're overthrowing garrisons. And we're not talking widespread, but we're saying there's a garrison, 6,000. The Jews, these zealots, the people who rise up will kill all 6,000 Roman soldiers. I mean, that was just unheard of. And because of these early victories, I mean, it shakes Rome to the core. This little nowhere upstart country is actually winning some battles against our Roman soldiers. As I say, Josephus is a general leading these kinds of men. Well, of course, the Romans are going to pick it up.
They didn't take it very well.
They didn't take it very well. They're going to start bringing in more troops from Syria. They're going to start bringing in more troops from Rome. So the troops start coming in. Now you got Josephus on the run, and he's got 40 men with him, and they're hiding. And you've seen these kinds of caves. If you remember, we looked at the wilderness of En-Gedi on a Sunday morning not too long ago. We talked about David and Saul in the wilderness of En-Gedi, there on the Dead Sea. And those are the kinds of things that were going on for Josephus. He had his 40 men. They ran. They're in a cave, and they get cornered. They're trapped, and the Romans now know where they are. And of course, in those kind of days, as we're going to see in a second, when you lay siege to Jerusalem, you don't have to go attack the walls. Just make sure you set up a good perimeter around them. You lay siege to it. The water runs out. The food runs out. In the end, people got to come out. So then you have your battle. So that's what starts to happen. They're in this cave. They're now trapped. They know they're trapped, and they know what happens to people that have really made them mad. You know, they get killed, and usually they make sure they suffer and are tortured a lot before they die.
Rome wants to make an example of them.
Rome always wants to make an example. So, knowing that, they're in this cave, and Josephus gives this the leader gives this impassioned speech. We will not let them take us. We will not give them the privilege of putting us to death. And so we need to take our own lives. And as you're going to hear the same sort of story again at Masada in just a few moments. So they said that's what we would need to wind up doing. And so what it is every third person winds up taking the life of that person, and it's going to wind up going down till in the end they will all die. Problem is you got 40 people. It's called Josephus' solution. It's a problem. It doesn't work out even, and in the end you're down to 2 people. Josephus and one other guy. And he said, do you really want to do this? He said, no, I don't either. Let's just surrender it. Let's not kill ourselves. So he gave this great speech. 38 of the 40 die.
Talked them all into it. They were on board. Mm-hmm. But then he kind of changes his mind.
Talked them all into it, gets down to him and says, I don't like this idea. So they surrender to the Romans, and the Romans take him as a slave. They know him to be the general. This one is going on. They don't put him to death. And it's not too long after this, the general is Vespasian, and Josephus has a vision. He is able to prophesy that Vespasian will become the new emperor of Rome. Well, Vespasian likes that idea. He's a general out here fighting in the fields, and he likes it, so he decides to kind of keep him around. If he's having those kind of visions from God, and he's sharing that kind of good news that I'm supposed to become the new emperor of Rome, I'll just keep this guy around, he and his one buddy. Well, it won't be too long until Nero will die. They will vote he's an enemy of the state. He commits suicide. They suddenly have one emperor, and then another emperor, and then another. They'll have 4 emperors in 1 year, and the last one is Vespasian. In 69, he becomes emperor. And he goes, hot dog, that guy over there prophesied it and said it was going to happen. He frees him as a slave and then makes him a Roman citizen. Vespasian has gone back to Rome now that he's going to be emperor. Along with him goes Josephus, and man, that's a pretty good guy, man. He prophesied, I'm now emperor of Rome. And so he sets him free as a slave, makes him a Roman citizen. He has his son, Titus, continue on the battles down in Israel. And so Josephus then becomes the mentor and the translator for Titus, his son. Because he's fighting there in Israel, and they may be speaking Hebrew, these other things. It's like, okay, what are these people saying here? What do we know about the Jews? So Josephus now becomes embedded with the Roman soldiers as he is working with the Emperor Vespasian's son, Titus, who ultimately will become emperor. And so Josephus is now with the Romans as they are now starting to continue their battles all across moving down from the north and heading towards Jerusalem and these sorts of things. The thing he does is he decides he's going to become the historian. And he is going to start writing all these things down that he knows are going on in the land of Israel in this 66 to 72, 73. He will be able to see it all and is able to talk about it from an incredibly unique perspective. And we don't have historians back in this day writing things down. What we know about this part in history is because of Josephus. It is amazing what he will capture and write down and be able to tell us. And one of the things that he tells us is there was this sect of Jews who were a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, he will talk a little bit about this sect and the followers of Jesus. This is one of the few, if not almost the only, place outside the Bible where we have a secular affirmation, if you will, say, yes, about Jesus. We read about Jesus in the four Gospels. We read them from the letters of Paul. But we don't have lots of other documents talking about Jesus. But we do in Josephus. And it's one of the ways that we are able to say, without a doubt, there was a Jesus of Nazareth who obviously lived and died at this period in history and left behind a group of followers. So that happens because of Josephus. He was a fascinating kind of guy. As I said, he wasn't real popular with the Jews. They called him very much a traitor. He was with the Roman army when it finally came. Everybody starts fleeing ahead of them, and they run to Jerusalem because that's the place to hole up. And the Romans come and they dig their trenches and they set up a siege, and they're just going to sit there for a good while, and it's getting so difficult and so bad that people can't get out. And I know my time is running short of my part of the story. And so they can't get out, and whenever people would try to flee and get across this large ditch that they dug, the Romans were right there to catch them. And as soon as they did, they nailed them to a cross and stick them in the right there inside of outside the walls to say, this is what you got coming.
Crucifixion they would put up those crosses almost like billboards along the road. That literally was the statement they were trying to make.
So, he was there. Inside the walls of Jerusalem were his mother and father and his wife. And it's in 70 that they do finally break through the walls, and it is estimated, Josephus tells us, somewhere around 1.1 million people will die. They come through and tear it down, burn it down, sack it. Jerusalem is destroyed. What did Jesus say?
Not one stone will be left on the other. The last of the zealots hid out in the temple, and they tore it down to ground level. And so if you go to Israel and you go to the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, that is not a remnant of the temple. It's a remnant of the retaining wall that Herod the Great built because he had expanded the temple so much that he had to expand basically the mountain to support it. And so the only thing that remains that's connected to the temple is a retaining wall. Nothing remains of the temple.
And that is a special place to go when you're going to see the Wailing Wall. When you come in and you kind of go down and you see all the people rolling up their prayers, sticking them into the stones that were put in place back in that day by Herod to build this incredible temple. And because the people revolted, it was the Sadducees who were going to say, don't do this. If you do this, we're going to get it. Now, does that remind you of any other thing? Remember, we're in Lent right now, and we're going to be seeing how it is the leaders of the Jewish faith at this point, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and all the people are waving their palm branches and exciting and shouting Hosanna, their fear is he's going to try to raise an army, and if he tries to raise an army and all the people get excited and we rebel against Rome, what's going to happen? Rome's going to come and they're going to crush us. And so they make the statement, one man must die for the good of the nation. That's what the Sadducees would have believed. Jesus must die for the good of the nation. If he gets these people inspired and they create a revolt, we're all going to lose. And they were actually right. Because when the revolt happens, 66 years later, it's just as they say. Everybody comes, Rome comes. And just as Jesus predicted, there will not be one stone left on top of another. They tear them all down. It was said, when they finally got through, you could drive a plow through the center of Jerusalem and not hit a rock. I mean, it was utter devastation. Put them all to the sword. There were a few who will get down in a cistern, like we're going to talk about, and they would hide out. And they would survive, and they would be able to tell Josephus about what they had lived through and what they had seen. And so Josephus is writing all this down, and he's able to record it, and he will write 2 works, and it is the Jewish War, and another one, the Antiquities of the Jews. And he talks so much about their life, their world, and what happened, and it's why we know in such detail today. And he was one of the most widely read historians for centuries. Now, many Jews would not read him because they felt he was such a rotten traitor. Though in the later years, many are beginning to say, but he did speak about us and our faith in a kind and good way, because Josephus would remain an observant Jew even though he was now with the Romans. Which wasn't all that hard if you figure out. His father was a priest. His father, as a priest, was embracing a Hellenistic lifestyle. So Josephus could embrace a Hellenistic lifestyle and yet still be an observant Jew, and he was. And so one of the things that happens is, obviously his first wife is killed there in the siege of Jerusalem. After the war is over and he goes back to Rome, they take a Jewish woman who's a slave and give that to him to be a wife. And so he takes her for his second wife. Apparently he wasn't a very good husband. She runs away. So then they give him a third wife, another Jewish woman. And in the end, he divorces her. That's not a good match either. And so finally he gets a fourth Jewish wife. You know, fourth time's a charm. They live happily ever after. They have several children. He is happily married. She is happily married. And life is good. And Josephus lives to 100. Not age, but 100 CE. So, born in 33, lived that. So 67 years old was a good life. In that day, when I told you earlier, the life expectancy was about 28 in Jesus' days. So he lives a long time. Incredible what he records, what we have today. And he lives through this incredible great revolt.
Well, because of Josephus, we know what happened at Masada. Masada is the summer palace of Herod the Great near the Dead Sea. And he built this it's a 3-tiered palace. Here's a model of it, built on 3 levels to capture the breezes that would come in off the Mediterranean. Now, this is by the Dead Sea, so it's the driest place on earth, one of the driest places. And so Herod the Great built ditches around all the surrounding area, the surrounding mountains. And it rains there, but the rains are infrequent and fast and hard. And so he built these ditches that as soon as it rained, these ditches would capture the runoff water, and he directed them to the base of the Masada mountain. And in the base of the mountain, he built cisterns, these huge areas to hold water. This will give you an idea of scale of how big these cisterns are. And so these would fill up with water, and then he would simply have slaves go down and haul the water back up to the top of the mountain. On top of Masada, he had a swimming pool and a Roman bathhouse. He understood he had to keep the Roman soldiers happy because they kept him alive. And so he built granaries on top of Masada. Now remember, he died in 4 BCE when Jerusalem was conquered in 70 CE, there was a group of about 900 to 1,000 Jews who were zealots who escaped, and they made their way to Masada. And once they got to the top of Masada, the grain that Herod the Great had supplied there was still edible to them. They were still able to use all the grain from Herod the Great, and the cisterns were full of water. And so they had all of these supplies at this desert fortress, and so they were able to hold out there until the Roman troops arrived. When they did, just like they did at Jerusalem, they built a wall around the entire mountain, and you can see traces of that still to this day, and several encampments around Masada where the Roman soldiers stayed. And then they built, this cuts it off, on the right side of the mountain, this is a siege ramp. And they built that within a few weeks. It's basically the size of a small mountain that they built. And they took a battering ram to the top of the Masada fortress. And for a while, the zealots on top were able to hold them back. But finally, one night, they knew that they would break through the next day. And so they knew that the men would be slaughtered in horrific ways if they were taken over. They knew that the women in their society would be raped and sold into slavery, and they knew that their children would be raised into a pagan tradition, which would have been, it would have been like losing your religion, losing your identity. And so they made the decision that they would deny the Romans their lives. And so what they did, they wrote the names of 10 leaders on shards of pottery, and they drew lots, and these leaders would take the lives of families within the community. And then within these 10 leaders, the last one drawn would take the lives of the leaders and then take his own life at the very end. We know what happened because there was a group of women and children who had no husband or father in their family, and so they hid out. And when the Roman soldiers broke through and they found all the bodies, they came across these survivors, and they told them the story of what had happened, and Josephus was there to record that. Years later, this is the place where the Israeli Air Force takes their vows. And they go to the top of Masada, and they take the vow, Masada shall not fall again. Now, they walk to the top, and they walk back down. It's called the snake path. This is the path that people would take to get to the top of Masada or to carry the water to the top. The nice thing is now we have gondola rides. If you can see right here, just to give you a size, these are full-size tour buses. So there on the left, right there, those are full-size tour buses. That's how big this area is. So we get to, here's a Roman encampment you can see again. So we get to use nice gondolas. But the main archaeologist at Masada was Yigal Yadin. He was the one who went to Masada and discovered so many different things. The funniest thing that he said was he found grain that was almost edible, which I think means he just didn't want to try it. But the most important find was he found shards of pottery with Hebrew names on them. And it seems to correlate to the writings of Josephus. Of course, throughout the years, people will argue different things, but it's an incredible place of deciding what their identity is there at Masada.
That's not bad. 730.08. To see what was going on with the struggles of the people, to understand that the state of Israel was not all of the same mind, that you had from the Sadducees, and the Sadducees, I had forgotten to say how when they were in Jerusalem and all these people had come and they were begging of them, make peace, that the zealots, also the Jews, everybody is Jewish, in these different camps were so mad about that idea that they would kill all of the Sadducees and hang their bodies on the wall, outside the wall, to say, no, we're not surrendering to anybody. And you who have made peace with the Romans through the years deserve to die. So you have really kind of a civil war going on basically within the Jewish faith as all this is taking place.
So between the Essenes, Sadducees, and Pharisees, the Pharisees are the only ones that survive.
And they are the ones who will lead what we know as modern-day Judaism to this day. They are the ones who are able to carry on the faith. So, great struggles, all at the time of Jesus. And then you try to put that against the backdrop of knowing what the Essenes are doing at this time in Qumran, knowing the struggles with the Sadducees and the Roman government, and then you go back and think about Jesus coming into the midst of all that with a different message, and in the end pulling together a small group of people who will continue on through all of this. And what happens in 70 when the temple is torn down, two things. One, Judaism is never the same because all sacrifices stop. The only place you sacrifice is at the temple. And when it gets torn down, the idea of sacrificing in Judaism ends. A whole different way of meeting. The synagogue is going to grow up. The way that their faith, it changes. But everybody is dispersed. And so what happens is you have all these people who are of the follower of Jesus who are getting dispersed throughout the world at the same time because of the fall of Jerusalem and the Romans conquering that area in 70. And so the Jews lose control of their homeland. Here's 1,000 years ago, you had King David, probably 11 to 1,200 years ago, the judges and Joshua moving in. They'll last all the way up to 70. So we get about 1,000 years, 1,100. They will lose control of the land until 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to be found. We're going to be ready for next week. Have a good week. Isn't that the truth? I mean, you know,